Oh man, this new arc update is just so nice. I have to share this with some people. Settings, I think, share. Whoa, what's this card? Imaginary teacher? Is that what Arc is calling me? Screw them. I'm gonna show them who is the real teacher here. Let's build this. In literally like 5 seconds, I was able to create this? Come on. And you think I can't teach? Let me show you. I am gonna teach you how to animate this card, and especially how to make that tilting animation when you hover the cursor. Because if we one more time go to the arc preferences and then move over this card, you see that it moves left and right whenever you move your card, and that there's also a little glossy animation that also moves over the card as well. And that's actually what we're gonna make today. Without further ado, let's get to it. So that animation that we're gonna make is pretty much a 3D animation because the card is rotating on a 3D-like axis. And what we need for that in CSS is called CSS perspective. Because as soon as you make a parent div of an element have perspective, then suddenly if you are rotating an element on the X or Y axis, it will rotate pretty much in 3D. So let's start by adding some perspective to this card. This whole div, that's actually what the card is, and the flex around it is just a wrapper div that's there, but it's not part of the card. However, we do need to have some sort of parent to set this perspective on, because the perspective will apply on all of its children and not on the parent itself. So the perspective, in Tailwind, there's no perspective class yet, because they're still working out how they really want to do that. But as for the perspective attribute, it's literally just perspective, and then you define a depth in pixels. So let's go with 800 pixels at first, and then I will show you in a second why it matters what value you set in here. So right now, this didn't change anything at all. However, if we now start to rotate our element, and we can, for example, do that by going into our inspector and then inspect our card, we go to the wrapper element of the card, and then we're going to say transform rotate X of, for example, 45 degrees, and you already see that the card tilts backwards. But if I now would go into that perspective and remove it again, you see that the transform is way different and it's absolutely not 3D. So this perspective adds the 3D functionality to CSS. Now, what does that 800 pixels do? Well, it somehow tells the browser how far or how close the camera is. If I would, for example, change this to 100 pixels, you suddenly see that we are really close to the camera and it looks like it's skewed a lot. So that is actually what this perspective does. And I think for today's animation, 800 pixels is about right because it gives the right feeling of depth, but it's really just a number that you have to tweak. If we then go back to our transform, and we would also, for example, add a rotate of Y of 25 degrees, you see that we really get like this 3D rotation with CSS only. So that's really great, right? Now, in order to do a transform on both the X and Y axis, but a different transform on both of these axes, in Tailwind, there's again no class yet because they're still working out how they want to do this whole perspective thing, even though perspective is around quite a while already. So please hurry. Anyway, that means that if we want to do this with Tailwind classes, we still need to use arbitrary selector where we need to define our own transform, unfortunately. But let's just stick with that for now. And of course, if you're not using Tailwind, you can definitely do this in CSS as well, and it probably will look a little bit prettier because you don't need these weird square brackets and underscores. But if you're using Tailwind, we have to live with that for now. So as for that transform, and we can add rotate X here as well and make it 45 degrees and then add an underscore instead of a space for the next attribute. That's rotate Y, and we make that 25 degrees. And then you see that I have a line wrapping on, so it goes to the next line, so at least you can follow along. But then I can remove this inline style and you see that my new style is applied. And we can simply change that by, for example, making it 15 degrees, and then you see that it rotates differently. And that is pretty much all there's to it to make an element look like it's 3D. But this would be really boring if we did not add any interaction with your cursor on top of it, right? So let's do that next. What we need to do to be able to rotate this based on the cursor position is we need to know, firstly, if the cursor is over the card, but also where it currently is relative to the width and height of the card. So how are we going to approach that? Well, firstly, let's add an onMouseMove event. And in there, we get an event. And that event contains, let's just add console.log, contains event.currentTarget.getBoundingClientErect. And this bounding client, if we would go to our log and then hover the card, you see that it gives us quite a lot of data. And in that data is the following. There's, for example, the X position and the Y position of the cursor, but also the current top left right position of where the element itself is positioned in the DOM. And this is exactly what we can use to get our mouse position on top of the card. However, there is one thing though, this getBoundingClientRect is quite a costly function to call. It causes a repaint every time you use it, which is just bad for performance if you use it way too much. So if there's a way to prevent it, I'd rather do it. So instead of reading it within the mouse move, because then you see that if we go back, it keeps on logging, check here in the bottom right corner, it keeps on logging every time you move, simply because we've attached to the onMouseMove event handler. So instead of doing that, I actually want to add a onMouseEnter event. And in there, we get exactly the same event. However, now I actually want to save this value and use it during the onMouseMove. I'm going to go ahead and create a const boundingRef equals useRef that will start as null. And as a value has a DOMRect or a null. So this way we can now use this ref within React to onMouseEnter set boundingRef.current equal to the currentTarget.getBoundingClientRect. So this way we set this value, and now inside our mouse move, we can simply use this ref instead of constantly needing to ask the element, what's your current bounding client look like? Firstly, we need to check if it doesn't exist, because in theory that would be possible. If it doesn't exist, we simply don't do anything yet, because then probably this function still needs to run. And then we can simply use this variable inside of our function down here instead of constantly calling it. One thing we still need to do though is also on mouse leaf, we need to set the bounding client ref.current to null. So we also reset it when you remove your mouse from the element. Okay, so now we've added a little bit of JavaScript, but we did not achieve a thing yet, right? So the next step is that we need to get the position of the cursor. And for that, we're gonna use this ref. So we're gonna need two variables. The first one is the X position. And you already see that Copilot is helping me a lot here. What it's suggesting is that we look at the client X and we subtract the left property from the bounding client. So what that does is actually the client X is the cursor position. So that would be, for example, if we're on the top left here, even though you're not hovering, it would be 0. But also in the left corner of our card, it won't be 0, but it will be the value of this distance, if it's X, of course. And then we subtract the offset the card has from the left of the screen. So this will give us, for example, if we log this, this will give us a value that's exactly the distance from the left side of the card. So this way we know the exact position of the cursor on the card. Then we're going to do the same for Y, which is client Y minus the current top position. And then we suddenly have two coordinates that are relative to the card, going from 0 to all the way to the width of the card. And now what I'm thinking is that I probably want this card to rotate in either direction, both on the X and Y axis, in 10 to minus 10 degrees. So we need to somehow convert this distance, X and Y, into a value that's between minus 10 and 10. The first thing I want to do is convert this pixel value into a percentage based on the total width and height of the element. We can do that by creating X percentage. That's then X divided by the width of this element. And we do the exact same for Y, which is the Y value divided by its current height. And that way we get a number that's a percentage of the width and the height. Don't trust me? Let's take one more look here. You see, we suddenly have a number that goes from 0 to 1 based in either direction where your cursor is. However, we don't really want a number that's between 0 and 1, but rather -5 and +5, because that's going to make it a lot easier to also have a number that goes from -10 to +10. And how can we get there? What we then need to do is multiply it by 20 to have a value that's between -10 and +10. Because if you, for example, let's say you have a value of 0.8 and you subtract 0.5 from it, you get 0.3 as a value. And that's exactly what we want. Because if you, for example, would get 0.5 minus 0.5, that equals 0. And then you're exactly in the middle of the element. And if you would then have 0.2 minus 0.5, that gives us minus 0.3. And then you do get the point, right? Because if we then multiply this by 20, we get -6 degrees, like Copilot is again suggesting already here. And that's exactly what we want. So let's create two more variables. The first one we call x rotation. And there we take the x and subtract 0.5 from it and multiply it with 20. And then we're going to do the exact same for a y. Rotation is y minus 0.5 times 20. And if we then change this log, and I'm also going to change it to console.table, you'll be surprised if you don't know this one, where we add this time then an object because it's a table. Watch this. Then we get a number that's really big, and that is because I need to take that percentage, of course, and not the pixel. That's what you get for listening to Copilot and stop thinking yourself. Because if we now refresh, then we get a value that goes from -10 approximately to +10. It says 8.5 now, but that's because it's skewed, so it's a little bit harder to reach the edges. And the same thing for the y-axis. If we get a value from -10 approximately to 10 at the bottom. So now we can use this value to rotate in a certain degree. Or actually, we pretty much already have the degree because that's what this rotation value now is. So instead of logging these variables, what I actually want to do next is put them into a CSS variable and then use that CSS variable inside of our rotate. And we can do that by setting event.currentTarget.style.setProperty. And then we're again gonna listen to Copilot saying the x rotation should be the value of the x rotation. And then we're gonna do the exact same for the y. However, if we would just simply apply this, we're gonna have a little problem. And this has to do with 3D, because what I'm not doing is I'm taking the x position based on the x-axis and I'm gonna set that into the x rotation. However, the x rotation is the horizontal axis, but it will spin this way. So it's pretty much the y rotation, then you could say. And the same thing for y. It's the vertical axis. That's the position we're taking. But if we would apply that, it would apply to the horizontal movement. It's just a 3D thing. These axes are a little bit different than what you would expect. So instead of putting the x on the x rotation, we need to put the y there and we need to put the x on the y. That might be a little bit confusing. Perhaps you want to add a comment here, or maybe you even want to rename your variables, but it's just the way it is and we gotta live with that because it's normal in 3D. We're gonna replace this 45 degree on the rotate x by our newly created variable. So let's add the -x rotation. And then we're also gonna add the rotate y by adding var -y rotation. And look at that. All of a sudden, the card is already moving. Great, right? There is, however, one thing that's not really correct, because some corners are moving towards the camera and others aren't. And that is actually because instead of doing y minus 0.5, we should actually revert that and do 0.5 minus the y. And then all of a sudden, all of the angles move in exactly the same direction. Now looking at Arc's example, what we still need to do is also when you hover this, it should actually scale up a little bit and only then the animation should apply. And when you move your cursor off the card again, it should scale down and remove the rotation as well. What we're going to do for that is we're going to add another value to the transform, and that's scale of 1.1. And also prefix our transform with hover, so it's only applied when we hover the card. And if you do that, you suddenly see that the card hovers and moves. And if we take our cursor off the card again, it suddenly goes back into place and it's not rotated anymore. We do, however, still need to add a bit of an animation to it because this is really janky, of course. And that's pretty easy by adding transition transform. And also add a ease in is nice, I think. It's moved here because I auto-saved. Of course, you can still tweak that easing to make it look a little bit nicer, but this is already really, really great. Now, ease in is not nice. We need to make it ease out. Yeah, look at that. All of a sudden, this card just, it moves so nice. There's only one thing missing now, and that's adding that glare. So let's do that as well. And I think then we call it a win for this teacher. A little bit arrogant, I know. First, let's add a gradient that we can use as that glare. You can do it in two ways. Personally, I would add a pseudo element, a after element that we would position with that gradient. But because I think that would make it a little bit harder during teaching here now, I'm actually gonna add a new div so you can really focus on this specific div instead of needing to look through all of these classes here. During teaching, I think it's a little bit easier. I would go ahead and create a new div here that's just an empty div. And then we're gonna add a class name on there of absolute and inset 0. That will make it the full width and height. And I've also making sure that the wrapper of the card is positioned relative. So it's positioned absolute towards the card itself. So if we would now give this a background of red 300, you already see that it's lying over top of everything. We of course need to make this pointer events none, so you can click through it and it wouldn't block any interacting with the cards. And then what we still want to do is the background. It will be a gradient in a second, but it shouldn't be always visible. It should only be visible when you hover the card instead of always. For that, I've already gone ahead and added also a group class to the card as well, because this way we can use that group by going into our overlay and using group-hover with the background of red. So now if we would hover the card, you see that it suddenly becomes red. And if we now turn this into a gradient and then make that gradient move, we have a super, super sexy looking card. Two things. First step is making that gradient. That means that we need to remove that background red. And then we're gonna use arbitrary values because we are gonna add a radial gradient. And that radial gradient to start will simply be at the center. And then for the colors, we are gonna add a RGBA value of transparent white of 0.3 at, for example, 20%. And then it will go to transparent at 80%. And then I see that I actually added a bracket at the end, but that bracket is part of the RGBA, so it should actually be here. And if we now save this, and then we hover over our card, you already see that there is a shine in the middle appearing. And that's actually the gradient that we've just added. Now we only still need to make this move with our cursor as well, and that's not too much work anymore. Because what we now need to know is we pretty much need to know that percentage where our cursor is. So that way we can use the exact position of the cursor to position our gradient instead of this at center. So let's just go back to our set property, and then we're gonna add event.currentTarget.style.setProperty. And then we're gonna define an X like Copilot is already suggesting. However, we should multiply this with 100. So we have a value that's between 0 and 100 and not 0 and 1. And then we can add the percentage sign. We're gonna do the same for Y. So we have two values, X and Y. And then we have this X and Y that we can use to position our gradient with. And for that, we can simply go to our at center and add a var --x underscore var --y. And then we are already positioning the gradient based on where the cursor is. If we now move over the gradient, you already see that this shine is actually moving along the card. A bit unsure how this is exactly working? Let's have a quick look and inspect that card one more time and then check the inline style. And then you can see that we have these X percentages and Y percentages that are actually updated. And these are what we're then using to position the gradient. Because if we look at our own gradient, and then we need to hover the group. So it is activated, hover, then we go to our group. You see that we use the X and Y variables to position that gradient. So it will simply say at 20%, 50%, for example. And this is then exactly the position of our gradient. That looks so great, right? And that also sums up the very last portion of this video. And look at that, by combining all these tools, perspective, as well as the cursor position and some CSS variables, we can suddenly make a card that looks really interactive. And that's a really nice thing to add to, for example, a profile page or something like that. Down below, you also find a link where you can find the code to play around with this yourself, and also an article version of what we built today. If you enjoyed today's video, again, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. And then I hope to see you in the next video.